Open a history book to the chapter on the Crimean War. You will read about honor. You will read about the charge of the Light Brigade, 600 men riding into death. You will read about Florence Nightingale walking through the hospitals with her lamp, an angel of mercy. You will read that Britain went to war in 1853 to save the weak Ottoman Empire from Russian aggression. It is a story of heroism. It is a story of noble sacrifice. But close that book, because what you are about to hear is the real story. The British Empire did not send its sons to die in the Crimean mud to save the Ottomans. They sent them to save their investments. The Crimean War was not a war of honor. It was a war of debt collection. And the weapon was not the rifle. It was the ledger. Let me take you to Constantinople in the year 1850. The Ottoman Empire stretched from the Balkans to Baghdad. It controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Its territories covered millions of square miles. The Sultan lived in palaces covered in gold and jade. The mosques had minarets that touched the sky. From the outside, it looked like an empire of majesty. But if you looked at the treasury, you would see the truth. The vaults were empty. The tax collectors were corrupt. The army was outdated. The Ottomans had guns from the previous century, while Europe had built rifles that could fire 5 times faster. The empire was not a lion. It was a dying beast covered in expensive fur. To the north, Russia was waiting. Tsar Nicholas I called the Ottomans the sick man of Europe. He wanted Constantinople. He wanted access to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. For centuries, Russia had been locked in by ice. If they could take the Bosphorus, they would control the gateway between Europe and Asia. For the British, this was unacceptable. Russia controlling Constantinople meant Russia controlling the trade routes to India. It meant the balance of power shifting east. The British needed the Ottoman Empire to stay alive, not because they liked the Turks, but because they needed a buffer zone. They needed a wall of flesh between Russia and their jewel, India. But here is where the trap was set. The Sultan Abdul-Majid needed money to modernize his army. He needed cash to buy new weapons, to train new soldiers. He turned to his allies in London and Paris. He asked for help. The British could have given him military advisors. They could have sent him weapons as gifts. But the bankers saw something else. They saw an opportunity. They saw a virgin market that had never borrowed a pound from Europe. For centuries, the Ottoman sultans had refused foreign debt. They knew that debt was a chain. They knew that if you borrow from a Christian king, you eventually serve him. But in 1854, with Russian troops gathering on the Danube, the Sultan was desperate. The British bankers approached him with a smile. They offered him a loan of £3 million. In today's money, that is hundreds of millions. They told him it was a gesture of friendship. They told him it was an alliance between brothers. But if you read the contract, it was a noose. The interest rate was high, but that was not the worst part. The worst part was the collateral. The bankers did not trust a promise. They demanded a guarantee. They demanded that the annual tribute from Egypt be sent directly to London. Egypt was the wealthiest province of the Ottoman Empire. It was the cash cow. By signing this paper, the Sultan was handing over his most reliable income stream to foreigners. He was selling tomorrow to survive today. But he felt he had no choice. He signed. The first foreign debt in Ottoman history was born. The trap was sprung. With the money in hand, the war began. British and French troops landed in Crimea in September 1854. The fighting was brutal. Disease killed more men than bullets. Cholera swept through the camps. Men froze to death in the winter mud. But back in London, the banks were celebrating. They were selling Ottoman bonds to the British public. They told widows and shopkeepers that buying these bonds was patriotic. They said it was a safe investment, guaranteed by the government. The British public poured their savings into these bonds. They thought they were helping the war effort. They did not know they were funding a Ponzi scheme. While soldiers died in the trenches of Sevastopol, the Sultan was spending the borrowed money. Some of it went to the war. New rifles were purchased. New cannons were cast. But a large portion disappeared. It went into the pockets of corrupt officials. It went to fund the Sultan's palaces and his lavish lifestyle. British advisers in Constantinople watched this happen. They saw the waste. They knew the money would never be paid back. But they did not stop it. They encouraged it. Why? Because the goal was not for the Ottomans to succeed. The goal was for them to become dependent. A debtor is a servant. As long as the Ottomans owed money to British banks, Britain controlled their politics. They could dictate trade policy. They could demand legal privileges for British citizens. The debt was a key to the palace that no army could provide. When the money from the first loan ran out in 1855, the British did not say stop. They said borrow more. The war was dragging on. The Ottomans needed more cash. So a second loan was arranged. This time it was £5 million. This time the collateral was the customs revenues from the ports of Smyrna and Syria. Piece by piece, the income streams of the empire were being mortgaged. The Ottomans were winning battles on the ground, but they were losing the war for their sovereignty in the bank. The ledger was bleeding red. The war ended in 1856. The Treaty of Paris was signed. Russia was forced to retreat. The British public celebrated. They thought they had saved the Ottoman Empire. They thought the sick man had been cured. But the opposite was true. The war had not cured the patient. It had hooked him on a deadly drug, the drug of easy credit. The Ottoman Empire emerged from the war with a victorious army and a mountain of debt it could not service. The interest payments were enormous. Revenue that used to go to the treasury now flowed to London. This meant the government had less money to run the country, which meant they had to borrow more just to survive. It was the classic debt trap. The bait was the first loan. The hook was the war. Now the line was being reeled in. In the years after the war, the Sultan tried to modernize. He wanted to build railways. He wanted telegraph lines and modern schools. He wanted his empire to be strong. But every project required capital, and the only place to get capital was London or Paris. The bankers were happy to lend. New loans were issued in 1858, 1860, and 1862. Each loan came with higher interest rates. Each loan came with harsher terms. The British government watched this with cold eyes. They knew the math did not work. A country cannot borrow at 12% interest when its economy grows at 1%. It is a mathematical impossibility. But they kept the loans flowing. Why? Because they were playing the long game. They knew the Sultan would eventually default, and when he did, they would come in and take everything. By the 1860s, the situation in Constantinople was surreal. The Sultan built the Dolmabahce Palace, a monument of crystal and gold on the shores of the Bosphorus. It cost 35 tons of gold. It was built entirely with borrowed money. The bankers in London knew this. They laughed about it in their clubs. They mocked at the Turks for spending their money on chandeliers while soldiers went unpaid, but they kept lending. The commission fees were massive. The banks were making fortunes even if the bonds eventually became worthless. It was a transfer of wealth, from the ordinary British investor to the pockets of elite financiers, from the Ottoman taxpayer to the vaults of London. The war had created the mechanism for the destruction of the Middle East. It taught the British that they did not need to conquer a country to own it. You just had to buy its debt. By the early 1870s, the snowball had become an avalanche. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a sovereign state. It was a financial colony. The interest payments consumed more than half of the empire's entire tax revenue. Think about that. For every dollar taken from a farmer in Anatolia, 50 cents went immediately to a bank in Paris or London. The money did not build roads. It did not pay soldiers. It vanished into the ledger of the foreign creditor. The empire was bleeding to death. The Sultan at the time, Abdul Aziz, was trapped. He had to take out new loans just to pay the interest on old loans. In 1873 and 1874, new bonds were issued, but the terms were predatory. The banks took huge commissions up front. The Ottoman treasury received only a fraction of the nominal loan. They were drowning. Then came 1875. It was a year of global financial crisis. A drought devastated the crops in Anatolia. Tax revenues collapsed. The global economy was in depression. The Sultan looked at his books. The game was over. He could no longer pay. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government announced a partial default. They would pay only half the interest due in cash. The other half would be paid in new bonds. The markets in London and Paris panicked. Ottoman bond values crashed. Thousands of British investors lost their savings. The illusion of the wealthy ally shattered. But for the British government and the major banks, this was the moment they had been waiting for. This was the foreclosure. The default triggered political chaos in Constantinople. Sultans were deposed. There were palace coups. The empire was unstable. Russia, sensing weakness, attacked again in 1877. The Ottomans fought bravely, but they were bankrupt. They lost territory. The empire was on the brink. In 1881, with the empire on its knees, the European powers presented their ultimatum. It was called the Decree of Muharrem. It was a document that ended the economic independence of the Ottoman Empire. The British, French, Germans, and other creditors forced the Sultan to sign over control of his economy. They created a new organization. It was called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. The OPDA was something unique in history. It was a bank that acted like a government. Its headquarters was a massive building in Constantinople, overlooking the Golden Horn. It was run by a board of directors appointed by European banks. The Sultan had almost no say. The OPDA was given the right to collect taxes directly from Ottoman subjects. They took control of the most profitable monopolies: the salt monopoly, the silk tithe, the stamp tax, the tax on spirits and fishing. If you were an Ottoman citizen and you bought a bag of salt, your money did not go to your sultan. It went to the OPDA. It went to British and French shareholders. This was the ultimate victory of the Crimean War strategy. Britain did not need to occupy the Middle East with soldiers. They occupied it with accountants. The OPDA had its own staff of thousands. They were more efficient than the Sultan's own government. They collected taxes with ruthless precision. Every penny owed to the European creditors was extracted from the Ottoman economy. The empire had become a farm. The harvest was exported to pay for the mistakes of the past. The impact of this financial slavery was devastating. The empire had no money to invest in defense or infrastructure. When they wanted to build railways, they had to give concessions to foreign companies. This allowed Britain and Germany to carve the empire into spheres of influence. The British took Iraq and the Gulf. The French took the Levant. The Germans took the route to Baghdad. The country was being sliced alive. This weakness paved the way for the First World War. The Ottoman Empire was forced to align with Germany because Britain and France were bleeding it dry. The Germans offered military aid. They promised to help break free from the stranglehold of the OPDA. When war started in 1914, the Ottoman goal was to abolish the debt administration. But it was too late. Decades of underinvestment and extraction had left the empire too weak. When the British Army marched into Jerusalem and Baghdad in 1917, they were not entering unknown lands. They were entering territories their banks had owned for 40 years. The military conquest was just the final step in a process that began with the loan of 1,854. The soldiers who died in Crimea believed they were fighting for freedom, but they were the shock troops for a financial takeover. They cleared the path for the bankers. Let that sink in. The war was never about saving the Ottomans. It was about creating the conditions for their financial submission. The handshake in 1854 was the knife. The loan was the poison. The default in 1875 was the death rattle. And the OPDA in 1881 was the funeral. Sovereignty is solvency. When you lose control of your money, you lose control of your country. The Ottomans learned this the hard way. They spent the last 40 years of their existence as a puppet. Their taxes went to foreign banks. Their resources were sold to foreign companies. Their destiny was written in ledgers in London. The Ottoman Empire eventually collapsed. From its ruins, the modern Middle East was born. But the legacy of the debt remained. The new nations of Turkey, Iraq, and Syria inherited portions of the debt. They started their existence burdened by the ghosts of the 19th century. Turkey did not finish paying off the Ottoman debt until the 1950s, nearly a century after the first loan. 3 generations lived under the weight of a decision made in 1854. That is the price of easy money. That is the cost of borrowing from those who smile while they sharpen the knife. The Palace of Dolmabahce still stands in Istanbul today. It is a museum now. Tourists walk through its crystal halls. They marvel at the gold on the ceilings. But few realize that those walls were built with the money that destroyed an empire. They are a monument to the trap set in 1854, a trap that proves the hand that offers you money is often the hand that holds the knife. The British Empire did not save the sick man of Europe. They kept him on life support just long enough to inherit his estate. And that is the true dark history of the Crimean War. This is the story they do not teach you in school. This is the chapter that is missing from the textbooks. Because history is not written by the conquered. It is written by the creditors. The Crimean War was not won on the battlefield. It was won in the boardrooms of London. It was won with contracts and interest rates. It was won with the slow, quiet violence of compound interest. The soldiers thought they were heroes, but they were collection agents. The treaty was not signed with a sword. It was signed with a pen dipped in red ink. If you want to understand the world today, you need to understand this. Debt is more dangerous than any army. It is silent. It is patient. It does not invade with tanks. It invades with loans and bailouts and structural adjustment programs. It does not conquer with violence. It conquers with interest rates. The Ottoman Empire fell because it could not balance its books. It fell because it traded its future for temporary survival. And once the debt was signed, there was no escape. The trap closed slowly, but it closed completely. Subscribe to this channel if you want to stay ahead, because the same game is being played today. Different countries, different banks, but the same ledger, the same trap. Empires fall in silence. They fall when the accountants take over from the generals, and by the time the public realizes what has happened, the foreclosure is already complete. Do not be the one who learns this lesson too late. Subscribe now. Join those who see what others miss, because when the history books are written, you will want to be among the few who saw it coming.